China is firmly opposed to U.S. interference in China's internal affairs. We have expressed our staunch opposition to such interference, and we will take firm actions in response. On human rights, we hope that the United States will do better on human rights. China has made steady progress in human rights, and the fact is that there are many problems within the United States regarding human rights, which is admitted by the US itself as well.
Now that was, of course, the first major summit between the Chinese Communist Party and the Biden administration in March this year. You know, I'm old enough to remember when it was Donald Trump who was supposed to be this blundering buffoon who'd embroil the free world in a war with China. But in the end, Donald Trump was actually treated with deference by Xi Jinping. Not because Xi Jinping liked Donald Trump, quite the opposite in fact, but because in the words of Ronald Reagan, you get peace through strength. Joe Biden, by contrast, does not project strength. And not just because he's a doddering geriatric whose cognitive peak came and went sometime in the mid-1990s, it's because he projects not strength, but wokeness. I mean, why would any belligerent power respect a country that doesn't respect itself?
It was a murder in the full light of day, and it ripped the blinders off for the whole world to see. The systemic racism the Vice President just referred to. The systemic racism is a stain on our nation's soul.
In this weekend's edition of the Spectator Australia, Maurice Newman goes into detail about the way in which America's biggest enemy is not China, but itself. Let's hear from him now. Maurice Newman, how are you?
Very well, thanks, Gideon. Good to see you.
Great to see you. Now, I loved your piece in the Spectator Australia this week. It's a very, very important piece. And I want to start with a quote that you included by a woman named Lydia Thomas-Greenfield, the US ambassador to the United Nations, who said to the UN, slavery is the original sin of America. It's weaved white supremacy and black inferiority into our founding documents and principles. What kind of a message is that to send to the rest of the world?
I thought it was an interesting comment to make to the United Nations of all people. And of course, the Chinese picked up on it and turned it back on the US. It is an extraordinary comment, and it shows a lack of awareness of where America sits in the world today and how other people are viewing America. I found it an astonishing comment. And of course, if she has encountered racism and all the things she talks about during her upbringing, it certainly doesn't seem to have stopped her upward mobility. She seems to have done pretty well.
Well, that's right, and that's a fair observation. But I mean, the tenor of the piece really is that amid a great geopolitical conflict, let's face it, that's basically where we are now in some sense. The US is not exactly presenting a united front, and you very aptly talk about the ways in which the Chinese are using the language of wokeness against the West.
They are, and they have the moral authority at the moment. I mean, it is quite extraordinary how quickly that turnaround has occurred. And of course, what you also know is that Patrice Cullor, who is the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, is a self-admitted fan of Mao Zedong. So they've got a fifth columnist who is working extremely hard for the China cause, ripping apart the US fabric. That's
right. And you mentioned in particular that Xi Jinping is using Leninist conflict and intimidation tactics. That's sort of an element that we haven't quite explored. And I guess it goes back to what I discussed with Senator James Patterson a little while ago, where we in the West think of war and peace as sort of a binary thing, a black and white kind of state of diplomatic relations, whereas in China there is, under the system of political governance there, and even culturally, there is a grey zone between war and peace. So how do you see the state of relations with China now between the US and China and the world in general?
Well, I think that the relationship between the United States and China is fraying. I think the Chinese see President Joe Biden as being weak and a socialist roader. So in that sense, they feel that they can take him further to the left. He's become somewhat equivocal when it comes to Taiwan. So I think that the Chinese feel they're they're in the box seat.
That's a very important issue, Taiwan. To me, that seems like a red line. That seems like it could be the Poland of this conflict, and that would be the last straw. But do you think that the US will rise to the occasion and defend the free and democratic Republic of China, or will that just be sold down the river a bit more like, the Anschluss, like Austria or Czechoslovakia or something?
Well, I think that's a risk. That's certainly a risk for the Taiwanese. And I think what seems to me to be driving China at the moment is an economy which had an initial spurt after COVID and is now looking quite soft and getting softer. And so I think it's important for Xi Jinping to project outward in order to distract what sort of tensions there are inside his own country. And I think we're seeing some of that. He has expressed earlier what he calls the China dream, which is the reunification of the provinces. So Hong Kong and now Taiwan. Taiwan is the largest semiconductor manufacturer in the world. So strategically, it is very important. But at the moment, China has moved about 500,000 troops into Fujian province. They've substantially increased the size of their airfield in Fujian. They have been overflying Taiwanese airspace at a low altitude in order to test the Taiwanese radar. Now, whether this is to provoke a response, which in turn would allow China an excuse to go in and do something, or it's simply seeing whether or not they can get people to the table, I don't know. But all we can say is that it is an avowed wish and a determination of President Xi to reunite what he calls the province of China, namely Taiwan.
Well, that's right. Actually, you raise a really, really good point, and that is that, we shouldn't be too pessimistic about the possible showdown with China emerging as the world's only superpower, because they have vulnerabilities too. And if history tells us anything, it is that central planning always fails. Monstrous regimes like this tend to fall over. You can suppress human freedom for a while, but not forever. So I suppose as somebody who's had a lot of experience in the business world, what are your insights into the pressures that China is facing economically and how that feeds into the point you were making about China having to effectively keep moving forward in the form of warfare and conflict to paper over economic cracks?
Xi Jinping, I suspect, sees the window that he has to do something about Taiwan closing quite rapidly. I mean, his belligerent attitude is causing the West, including the European Union, by the way, and Canada and other countries, to take actions which will realign their distribution and their supply chains. Clearly, they're too dependent on China, and that is going to have an impact on the economy. He has a population which is aging rapidly and is starting to decline. That's another problem he has. It's also creating some issues domestically because it's affected workers who are no longer in jobs. Many of them are at the more or less the retirement age, but their unemployment insurance is really more not being accessible to the people who need it. The other thing is that China is very highly leveraged, and they really don't understand the separation of power between that we have in democracies, and so they feel when they're dealing with a Joe Biden or even a Morrison, that they're dealing with similar leaders who are able to decide what to do and what not to do. And so they just go at each other full pelt. But what's happening is they're losing a lot of popular support. It's interesting that 3 years ago, there was a Pew Research Attitudes survey in Australia, which showed that support for China was running at 64%. 3 years later, that's now, it's down to 15. Now, what I think Xi Jinping doesn't understand is that sort of loss of support does impact on the policies of democracies, because obviously our politicians will react to that.
You're right, and I think I was in one of the. I'm in that category of people who went from the 64 to the 15%. I have become extremely hawkish on China just over the last few years because we really have entered a new era. But speaking of new eras, I'm old enough to remember when it was Donald Trump who was supposed to be this buffoon who would drag us into a new world war. He'd inflame tensions with China and everything else. Fast forward 4 years, Donald Trump is the only president in living memory not to commence a war. And Joe Biden is looking like a sort of von Hindenburg type character, sleepwalking towards it. So in your piece, you spoke a lot about the fact that the US under its current leadership, I guess, isn't match fit for conflict with China. Would you mind elaborating a little bit on what the Biden administration is doing that's putting the free world in danger?
Well, I think it's just showing itself to be weak, internally riven. Clearly, the woke movement, which is destroying the social cohesion from within. We've got so many movements now, the defund the police, Black Lives Matter. So much is distracting from any sort of unity. And I think you'd have to say that Mr. Biden appears to be more of a Trojan horse than a president. And that it's a squad or whoever it is in the background there we've seen a vision of Mr. Biden asking whether he should take questions, which begs the question, who is it he's asking as to
Kamala Harris
get permission? And so I think this is eating away at the social fabric of the United States. It's having an impact on the way in which Americans see one another. And this is all to Xi Jinping's, all to make him look stronger at home and stronger internationally. The more, in a relative sense, the United States looks weak and internally divided, the more Xi Jinping looks stronger on the international stage. And I think this is a very real problem for the United States and a real problem for all of us.
It is a real problem for all of us. And finally, look, the problems you've outlined aren't necessarily contained to the United States, unfortunately. When you have a new national curriculum, basically, that proposes to teach school children to be ashamed of their country and that we're nothing but a bunch of white oppressors, when you have absurdly nonsensical anti-racism speech codes and all sorts of other things, when you have the fact that we're having all these problems going on internationally and we're getting hung up on things like pronouns, how worried should we be about Australia's unity and strength in the face of this threat?
Well, extremely worried, because what it does is to eat away at the fabric. It destroys values and pride in one's culture and the achievements that we have made. I mean, one of the things that really did surprise me about the ambassador, who, as I say, has risen apparently from poverty to be the US representative at the United Nations, which I would have thought was a reasonable promotion, that she is able to decry and demean the United States, its achievements. And as I say in that piece, there will be no civil war in China to end slavery. And we know there is slavery in China at the present time.
Yeah.
There will be no equal opportunity laws which will be enforced as they are in the United States. We won't get the equity which we see in the application of the law in the United States. So that same sort of thing applies to Australia. And I find it extraordinary that a country that has been so successful and has been able to absorb people from so many places. And again, Australia and the United States is seen as a very, very desirable destination for the oppressed of the world. So that wouldn't seem to me, I don't see them flocking to China or to Iran or North Korea.
Well, that's exactly right. Well, look, we will rise to this challenge. And beneath it all, we should be optimistic. Freedom defeated fascism before, and it will again. But in the meantime, Maurice Newman, thank you so much for coming on. We always love hearing a great common sense take on the issues that matter. And well done again on your terrific piece in this weekend's edition of The Spec.
Thank you very much. Thank you.